Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're looking at something every single one of us does, but we rarely think about the actual physical impact it has on our minds. We're exploring the neural architecture of chronic complaining. We're going to see exactly how our daily interactions, the things we say, and those little frustrations we voice actually, literally shape the physical structure of our brains.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever wondered what happens biologically inside your head when you vent about a bad day? Like, what exactly does complaining do to your brain? Well, it turns out it is not just harmless hot air disappearing into the ether. It actually leaves a tangible, lasting mark.
Section 1. We all grumble.
Now, before we get into the heavy neuroscience of the whole thing, let's establish a baseline reality here, just to make sure nobody feels judged right out of the gate. Researchers from Clemson University have actually empirically demonstrated that everyone grumbles on occasion. It's just a universal human trait. So if you're watching this right now thinking, oh no, I complained about the weather this morning, I'm ruining my brain, don't worry, a little grumbling is totally normal.
But, there's a distinct measurable line between an occasional sigh of frustration and a persistent chronic behavioral pattern. Negative people are almost always complainers, pretty much without fail. And honestly, what's worse is they're rarely satisfied keeping those thoughts and feelings to themselves. Instead, they actively seek out unwilling participants to vent to, basically projecting their negativity and dragging everyone else right into their mental ecosystem.
Section 2. Neurons firing and wiring.
Now, what's really interesting here is the science. Let's look at the actual biological mechanism behind how our habits physically sculpt our gray matter. There's this famous, really foundational phrase in neuroscience: neurons that fire together wire together. It absolutely perfectly captures the direct relationship between our recurring thoughts, the neurons that fire, and the actual structural changes in the brain, how they wire together. Essentially, every single time you complain, you're firing specific neural pathways and literally making them stronger.
And that brings us to a really profound realization. Your experiences, behaviors, thinking, habits, thought patterns, and ways of reacting to the world are inseparable from how your brain wires itself. Think about that for a second. It means you aren't just passively experiencing your life. You are literally mapping and altering your brain's physical architecture with every single habitual reaction you have.
Section 3. The downward spiral.
So when those structural changes in your brain lean consistently towards the negative, well, the consequences become quite serious. Consider what happens in conditions like depression. There's actually nothing fundamentally wrong or broken about the brain itself. Rather, it's simply that the particular tuning of these neural circuits creates a tendency toward a depressed pattern. It involves this dynamic interaction of circuits dealing with stress, planning, habits, and decision-making. Once a negative pattern starts forming across these circuits, it causes dozens of tiny, incremental changes all throughout the brain.
And this brilliantly illustrates how that downward spiral accelerates into a total chain reaction. When harmful behaviors like chronic complaining are allowed to just loop continually within the brain, it inevitably alters your thought processes. Over time, those altered thoughts harden into altered beliefs, which ultimately dictate a fundamental change in your outward behavior. It's essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy written directly into your biology.
Section 4. The negativity bias. Now, you might be wondering why breaking out of this downward spiral feels so inherently difficult for the human brain. Well, we actually have a biological hurdle we have to clear, called the negativity bias. Basically, this is the brain's inherent tendency to focus way more on adverse circumstances than positive ones. What this means for you is that your brain is essentially hardwired to act like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. It's an old survival mechanism meant to keep us safe from threats, but man, in the modern world, it makes the habit of complaining dangerously sticky.
Section 5. 3 types of complainers.
All right, so now that we understand the internal mechanics and biases, how do we actually recognize these destructive behavioral loops out in the real world? We can categorize complainers into 3 distinct archetypes that you've more than likely encountered at work, in your family, or among your friends. We've got attention-seeking complainers, chronic complainers, and low-E.Q complainers. Let's look at how to spot them.
Just to give you a quick, practical field guide here. Attention-seeking complainers, well, they simply want attention. And they get it by dwelling on how they've got it so much worse than everyone else. Ironically, rational people usually just end up completely ignoring them to save their own mental energy. Then you have the chronic complainers. These folks live in a constant state of complaint. If they aren't actively voicing a woe-is-me attitude, you can bet they're internally brooding over one. And finally, my personal favorite, the low-E.Q complainer.
These people have absolutely zero interest in your perspective, your thoughts, or your feelings. To them, you aren't really a conversational partner, you're just a sounding board, or literally a brick wall for them to vent at whenever they get the opportunity.
Section 6. Rewiring for the better.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because we are absolutely going to conclude on a triumphant note today. The brain has this incredibly amazing ability to heal and adapt. Remember the neuroplasticity we talked about earlier? Well, the rule that neurons that fire together, wire together, is actually entirely neutral. It works both ways. Just as negative habits change your brain for the worse, positive practices literally change your brain for the better. You are the architect of this whole process. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that because the brain is plastic, we never have to feel stuck with our current wiring. By actively choosing positive practices over chronic complaining, we can achieve some seriously staggering things. We can actually increase our intelligence, our IQ. We can learn completely new, life-changing skills. And in some truly remarkable instances, people can even use these exact same principles to recover from physical brain damage. The capacity for positive transformation is just vast.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. Every conversation you have, every frustration you vent, and every positive thought you choose to nurture is, right at this very moment, actively shaping the physical structure of your mind. So, knowing what you know now, take a moment to ask yourself, how is your brain wiring itself today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.